Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful 3-hour journey through the life of one of history's most fascinating and complex rulers, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who played the most dangerous game of all, the game of power itself. For over 4 decades, Elizabeth navigated treacherous waters of politics, religion, love and war, crafting an image of strength while hiding her deepest vulnerabilities. Her story is one of sacrifice, brilliance, and the ultimate price of choosing a crown over a heart. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love for you to be part of our gentle community. If you're feeling a bit shy, don't worry. Even a simple hello in the comments would make my day. Perhaps you could share which historical queens fascinate you most, or simply let me know you're here listening along. And if this soothing tale helps you find rest, a gentle like and subscribe would mean the world to me, and helps bring these peaceful stories to other sleepy souls like yourself. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Tudor England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Elizabeth, later known as Queen Elizabeth I of England, entered this world on a crisp September morning in 1533 at Greenwich Palace, amid circumstances that would define her entire existence. Her very birth was both a triumph and a catastrophe, the culmination of her father Henry VIII's desperate gamble to secure a male heir, and yet another devastating disappointment when the awaited son turned out to be a daughter. The story of Elizabeth's perilous beginning must start with her mother, Anne Boleyn, a woman whose own dangerous game with power would end in tragedy. Anne had captivated the King of England, a feat that seemed impossible given Henry's devotion to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Yet Anne possessed something Catherine had lost, the promise of giving Henry what he craved above all else, a legitimate male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Henry's obsession with securing his lineage had already torn England apart. His determination to annul his marriage to Catherine led to England's break with the Catholic Church, the establishment of the Church of England, and Henry's declaration of himself as supreme head of the English Church. The political earthquake that followed this decision would reverberate through Elizabeth's entire life, making her both Protestant by birth and Catholic target by circumstance. When Anne Boleyn became pregnant, astrologers and courtiers predicted confidently that the child would be male. Preparations were made for a prince. Announcements were drafted celebrating the birth of a son. The royal nursery was prepared with all the magnificent trappings befitting a future King of England. Henry was so certain of his coming son that he had already begun planning the boy's education and future. But on that September morning, when the cries of a newborn filled the chambers of Greenwich Palace, those cries belonged to a girl. The disappointment was immediate and crushing. The pre-written announcements had to be hastily altered, with an "es" awkwardly added to "prince" to make "princess." The celebrations were muted, the joy forced. Henry's reaction was controlled but devastating in its coolness. For Anne Boleyn, this moment marked the beginning of her end. She had promised Henry a son, had staked everything on her ability to give him what Catherine could not. The birth of Elizabeth, while not Anne's fault, was seen as her failure. The whispers began immediately. Perhaps God was punishing Henry for his break with Rome. Perhaps Anne Boleyn was not the answer to England's prayers after all. Little Elizabeth, innocent of the political machinations surrounding her birth, was nevertheless caught in their web from her very first breath. She was a princess, but a disappointing one. She was heir to the throne, but not the heir her father wanted. She was born into privilege, but also into danger, for her very existence represented both Henry's defiance of the Catholic Church and his failure to produce the male heir that would justify that defiance. The early months of Elizabeth's life passed in a strange mixture of royal ceremony and underlying tension. She was acknowledged as heir presumptive, with all the ceremony and recognition that position entailed. A magnificent christening was held at Greenwich, with the most important nobles of England as her godparents. Her household was established with the grandeur befitting a future queen, with over 250 servants attending to her needs. Yet even as these ceremonial recognitions took place, darker currents swirled around the court. Henry was already beginning to lose interest in Anne Boleyn. The woman who had once captivated him completely was now the mother of yet another daughter, and Henry's attention was beginning to wander. Anne, desperate to maintain her position and provide the son she had promised, became increasingly anxious and temperamental, which only served to alienate Henry further. The dangerous game Anne Boleyn had played, using her sexuality and her promise of fertility to topple the Queen and remake England's religious landscape, was beginning to turn against her, and little Elizabeth, gurgling peacefully in her magnificent nursery, was about to learn the first hard lesson of Tudor life, that love, loyalty, and even family bonds were always secondary to political necessity. As Elizabeth grew from infant to toddler, the situation around her deteriorated rapidly. Anne Boleyn suffered a series of miscarriages, each one reducing her value in Henry's eyes and increasing the danger to both mother and daughter. The king, who had once defied the Pope himself for Anne's sake, now found her presence irritating, her anxiety tiresome, her failure to produce a son unforgivable. By the time Elizabeth was 2.5 years old, her mother's fate was sealed, though the little girl could not understand the significance of the strange tensions in her household, the worried looks of her servants, or her father's increasing absence from her life. The morning of May 19, 1536, dawned grey and overcast, as if the English sky itself mourned what was about to unfold. Elizabeth, now 2 years and 8 months old, woke in her nursery at Greenwich Palace, unaware that this day would shatter her world forever. While she played with her toys and took her morning meal, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was being led to a scaffold within the Tower of London, where a French executioner waited with a sharp sword. The charges against Anne were spectacular in their accusations and thin in their evidence: adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, treason against the king, and plotting Henry's death. Most historians now agree these charges were fabricated, a convenient way for Henry to rid himself of a wife who had failed to give him sons and whose strong personality had begun to irritate him. Anne Boleyn had become politically inconvenient, and in Tudor England, political inconvenience was often a fatal condition. When the sword fell that morning, it severed more than Anne Boleyn's head. It cut Elizabeth's life in two. In a single stroke, the little princess went from heir presumptive to illegitimate child. Her parents' marriage was declared null and void, meaning she had never been legitimate at all. The Act of Succession, hastily passed by Parliament, removed her from the line of succession entirely. Elizabeth Tudor was no longer a princess. She was simply Lady Elizabeth, a bastard daughter with no claim to the throne. The transformation in Elizabeth's circumstances was immediate and harsh. Her household was drastically reduced, her magnificent clothes and jewels taken away, her very identity stripped from her. The servants, who had once bowed deeply when she passed, now treated her with casual indifference. The future Queen of England had become, in legal terms, nobody at all. But perhaps more devastating than the material changes was the emotional abandonment that followed. Henry VIII, having removed the legal obstacle of Anne Boleyn, threw himself into his courtship of Jane Seymour with the enthusiasm of a man who believed his troubles were finally behind him. For Elizabeth, this meant the complete withdrawal of whatever paternal affection Henry had shown her. The father who had once delighted in her precocious intelligence and red gold Tudor hair now barely acknowledged her existence. The psychological impact of this abandonment on a child not yet 3 years old cannot be overstated. Elizabeth's first lesson in the dangerous game of power was brutal and personal. Love was conditional. Family bonds could be severed by political necessity. And survival meant learning to depend on no one but yourself. It was a lesson that would shape every relationship she would ever have. Fortunately for Elizabeth, not everyone at court was willing to discard her so easily. Lady Margaret Bryan, her governess, fought fiercely to maintain some dignity and proper treatment for her young charge. In letters that survive to this day, we can read Lady Bryan's desperate pleas to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, begging for proper clothes for Elizabeth, for acknowledgement of her basic needs, for some recognition that even an illegitimate royal daughter deserved better treatment than a servant's child. She hath neither gown, nor kirtle, nor petticoat, nor no manner of linen, nor forismocks, nor kerchiefs, nor sleeves, nor rails, nor body stitchets, nor handkerchiefs, nor mufflers, nor biggins, Lady Bryan wrote, listing the clothes Elizabeth lacked. The detailed inventory of a little girl's missing wardrobe becomes heartbreaking when we remember that this child had once been dressed in cloth of gold and ermine. Even more touching were Lady Bryan's observations of Elizabeth's character during this difficult period. She is as toward a child, and as gentle of conditions as ever I knew any in my life, she wrote. Despite the upheaval in her world, despite the confusion and loss, Elizabeth remained a sweet, intelligent, eager to please child. She was learning to be charming when it served her, quiet when it was safer, and always, always watchful. The arrival of Jane Seymour as Henry's third wife brought some stability to Elizabeth's situation, though it came at the cost of further reducing her importance. Jane, unlike Anne Boleyn, was gentle, submissive, and most importantly, capable of producing healthy sons. When Prince Edward was born in October 1537, Elizabeth's position shifted once again. She was no longer Henry's only child, no longer even his only daughter, but simply one of several royal offspring, and not the most important one. Yet Jane Seymour's influence on Elizabeth's life was largely positive. Unlike her predecessor Catherine of Aragon, who had always seen Elizabeth as a symbol of her own displacement, Jane seemed to bear no grudge against Henry's daughters. She encouraged Henry to bring both Mary and Elizabeth back into the royal household, arguing that it was appropriate for a prince to be surrounded by his sisters. This was perhaps the greatest gift Jane Seymour ever gave Elizabeth, the chance to be part of a family again, even if a complicated one. The brief period when Jane, Mary, and Elizabeth formed a makeshift family was probably the most normal time in Elizabeth's entire childhood. She began to receive a proper education again, with tutors engaged to teach her languages, music, and the classics. Her quick mind, starved of intellectual stimulation during her years of neglect, absorbed knowledge eagerly. By age 4, she was already showing signs of the brilliant intelligence that would mark her entire life. But even this relative stability was short-lived. Jane Seymour died just 12 days after giving birth to Edward. leaving Henry devastated and the royal household once again in upheaval. Elizabeth, now 4 years old, had watched another mother figure disappear from her life. The pattern was becoming clear. People she cared about left, whether through death, political necessity, or her father's whims. Henry's grief over Jane's death was profound and lasting. She was the only one of his wives to give him a living son, and he would choose to be buried beside her years later. But his grief also meant a return to the instability and neglect that characterized Elizabeth's early years. Henry withdrew from his children, immersing himself in his role as king and leaving their upbringing to others. When Henry VIII married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, in 1543, Elizabeth was 9 years old and had already learned to be wary of new stepmothers. She had seen what happened to women who married her father. They disappeared one way or another. But Catherine Parr proved to be different from her predecessors, and her influence on Elizabeth would be profound and lasting. Catherine was a woman of remarkable intelligence and education, unusual for her time. She had been married twice before coming to Henry, making her the only one of his wives with substantial life experience beyond the cloistered world of royal courts. More importantly, she was a Protestant reformer, deeply committed to the new religious ideas that were reshaping England. Under Catherine's guidance, Elizabeth's education took on a seriousness and depth that would serve her for the rest of her life. The curriculum Catherine arranged for Elizabeth was extraordinary, even by the standards of royal education. Elizabeth studied Latin until she could speak it as fluently as English, delved deep into Greek philosophy and literature, learned French and Italian, until she could conduct diplomatic conversations in both languages. She studied history, particularly the rise and fall of ancient empires, learning lessons about power that would prove invaluable in her later reign. But perhaps most importantly, Catherine ensured that Elizabeth received a thorough grounding in Protestant theology and English religious history. Elizabeth learned to understand the complex religious and political forces that had shaped her father's reign and would continue to influence England long after his death. She studied the arguments for English religious independence, the theological justifications for Henry's break with Rome, and the political necessity of maintaining England's Protestant character. This education was not merely academic, it was preparation for survival in a world where religious affiliation could mean the difference between life and death. Catherine understood that Elizabeth, as Anne Boleyn's daughter, would always be viewed with suspicion by Catholics both in England and abroad. The girl needed to be thoroughly grounded in Protestant theology, not just for her own spiritual development, but as armor against future attacks. The intellectual relationship between Catherine and Elizabeth was warm and genuine. Catherine encouraged Elizabeth's natural curiosity, praised her quick comprehension, and treated her more like a promising student than a potentially inconvenient stepdaughter. For Elizabeth, this period represented the first time in her life when her intelligence was not just recognized, but actively cultivated by someone who had power to protect her. In 1544, Catherine's influence helped bring about a crucial change in Elizabeth's legal status. Henry, perhaps influenced by his wife's arguments or simply wanting to provide more security for the succession, restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession through the Third Succession Act. While they remained technically illegitimate, their parents' marriages were still considered invalid. They were now recognized as potential heirs if Edward died without children. This restoration was enormously significant for Elizabeth's future, but it also made her situation more dangerous. She was no longer just Henry's bastard daughter. She was once again a person of potential political importance, someone who might one day wield real power. This meant she needed to be even more careful about her behavior, her associations, and her religious beliefs. The lessons Catherine taught Elizabeth went far beyond formal education. Catherine was showing Elizabeth, through her own example, how an intelligent woman could survive and even thrive in the dangerous world of Tudor politics. Catherine managed to maintain Henry's affection, avoid the fates of her predecessors, and exercise real influence over religious and educational policy, all while presenting herself as the perfect picture of wifely submission. Catherine was teaching Elizabeth the art of strategic femininity, how to be strong while appearing gentle, how to be influential while seeming deferential, how to play the dangerous game of court politics while maintaining a reputation for virtue. These lessons in political theatre would prove crucial to Elizabeth's later success as queen. But even Catherine Parr's careful navigation of court politics could not protect Elizabeth from all dangers. In 1544, when Elizabeth was 11, she had her first direct experience of just how precarious her position remained. Henry, always paranoid about potential threats to his rule, became convinced that Catherine herself might be plotting against him. Influenced by her Protestant beliefs and her intellectual pursuits, for several terrifying weeks, it seemed that Catherine might follow Anne Boleyn to the executioner's block. Elizabeth watched as her beloved stepmother walked a tightrope, using every ounce of her intelligence and political skill to convince Henry that she was a loyal, submissive wife who would never dream of challenging his authority. Catherine's survival required her to publicly renounce many of her intellectual pursuits and to present herself as a woman who had overstepped proper feminine boundaries in her enthusiasm for religious study. The crisis passed, but Elizabeth had learned another crucial lesson. Even the most careful, intelligent, and seemingly secure woman was never more than a political miscalculation away from destruction. Love, loyalty, and even outstanding service of the crown were no guarantee of safety in the Tudor world. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, Elizabeth was 13 years old and had already received an education in survival that would serve her well in the years to come. She had learned to be charming but not too forward, intelligent but not threatening, pious but not fanatical. She had mastered several languages, absorbed centuries of political philosophy, and most importantly, learned to read the dangerous currents of court politics. But her education in the dangerous game of power was far from over. The most perilous lesson of all was about to begin, and it would involve matters of the heart as well as politics. Catherine Parr's marriage to Thomas Seymour would create a scandal that nearly destroyed Elizabeth's reputation before her adult life had even begun. After Henry's death, Catherine Parr found herself free to marry for love for the first time in her life. Her choice fell upon Thomas Seymour, Baron Seymour of Sudeley, a man whose charm was matched only by his ambition and his dangerous lack of judgment. Seymour was the uncle of the new King Edward II, which made him one of the most powerful men in England, but he was also reckless, vain, and completely unsuited to the delicate responsibilities his position required. Catherine's marriage to Seymour was passionate and genuine, but it created an impossible situation for Elizabeth. She was living in Catherine's household when the marriage took place, making her an unwilling witness to the complicated dynamics between her beloved stepmother and her new troublesome husband. What followed would become one of the most dangerous scandals of Elizabeth's life, threatening both her reputation and her position in the succession. Thomas Seymour's behaviour toward the teenage Elizabeth was inappropriate by any standard. He would enter her bedchamber early in the morning, sometimes wearing only his nightshirt, and engage in what he called playful romping, tickling her, slapping her, and making jokes about her developing body. When Elizabeth slept with Catherine Parr, Seymour would join them in bed for these morning games, with Catherine sometimes participating and sometimes looking on with growing unease. Modern readers will immediately recognize this behavior as completely inappropriate sexual contact with a minor, but the standards of Tudor England were different, and the situation was complicated by the genuine affection that existed between all parties. Catherine Parr loved both her husband and her stepdaughter, and she seems to have convinced herself initially that Seymour's behaviour was merely playful, the kind of rough affection an uncle might show to a niece. But Elizabeth was not an ordinary 13-year-old girl. She was a princess, a potential heir to the throne, and any hint of sexual impropriety could destroy her chances of ever ruling. More immediately, any suggestion that she had been sexually involved with Thomas Seymour could be construed as treason, since he was the brother of the Lord Protector and uncle to the king. The political implications of the situation were enormous and potentially fatal. Elizabeth herself seems to have been both attracted to and frightened by Seymour's attention. She was an intelligent teenager experiencing her first encounter with adult sexuality, and Seymour was a handsome, powerful man who paid her attention in ways that were both thrilling and confusing. But her political education had taught her to recognize danger, and she began to realize that Seymour's behavior was putting her at risk. The situation came to a head when Catherine Parr discovered Elizabeth and Seymour in what appeared to be a compromising embrace. The exact details of what Catherine saw have been lost to history, but her reaction was immediate and decisive. She sent Elizabeth away from her household immediately, despite the genuine love between stepmother and daughter. The separation was devastating for both Elizabeth and Catherine. Their surviving correspondence shows the pain both felt at the forced separation, with Catherine writing warmly about Elizabeth's intelligence and promising that the separation was temporary. But Catherine was already pregnant with Seymour's child, and the stress of the situation, combined with the physical demands of pregnancy, was taking a toll on her health. Catherine Parr died in September 1548, just days after giving birth to her daughter. For Elizabeth, this was another devastating loss. The woman who had been more of a mother to her than anyone else was gone, and the circumstances of their separation meant that Elizabeth was left with guilt as well as grief. She had lost Catherine partly because of Seymour's inappropriate behaviour, but she was also aware that she had not been entirely innocent in the situation. With Catherine dead, Thomas Seymour's behaviour became even more reckless and dangerous. He began making overtures about marrying Elizabeth, apparently believing that his charm and her obvious attraction to him would overcome the political obstacles to such a match. He seems to have convinced himself that he could marry Elizabeth, become her consort when she inherited the throne, and thereby gain the ultimate prize in the dangerous game of Tudor politics. But Seymour had badly miscalculated both Elizabeth's political sophistication and the level of surveillance under which she lived. The Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, Thomas's brother, was already suspicious of Thomas's ambitions and had agents watching both him and Elizabeth carefully. When Thomas began his campaign to win Elizabeth's hand, he was walking directly into a trap that would ultimately cost him his life. The arrest of Thomas Seymour in January 1549 sent shockwaves through the English court and placed 15-year-old Elizabeth in the most dangerous position of her young life. The charges against Seymour were serious: plotting to marry Elizabeth without royal consent, attempting to gain control of the young King Edward II, and planning to overthrow the Lord Protector. In Tudor England, such charges typically led to one place, the executioner's block. But for Elizabeth, Seymour's arrest meant something even more terrifying. She was now under suspicion of treason herself. If it could be proven that she had encouraged Seymour's advances, had agreed to marry him, or had participated in any plots against the government, she too could face execution. The political education she had received from Catherine Parr was about to be tested in the most literal life or death circumstances. The interrogation that followed was a masterclass in teenage political survival. Elizabeth was questioned repeatedly and intensively by Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, one of the government's most skilled interrogators. Tyrwhitt was tasked with breaking down Elizabeth's defences, getting her to admit to inappropriate behaviour with Seymour, and ideally implicating her in treasonous activities. But Elizabeth, despite her youth, proved more than capable of matching wits with seasoned political operators. Her responses to questioning were carefully crafted, revealing nothing while appearing to be completely forthcoming. She acknowledged that Seymour had behaved inappropriately, but insisted that she had never encouraged him. She admitted that there had been talk of marriage, but claimed that she had never agreed to such discussions. She presented herself as an innocent victim of an adult man's inappropriate attention, rather than a willing participant in political intrigue. Most importantly, Elizabeth understood that her interrogators were looking for any sign of political ambition, any indication that she saw herself as a rival to her half-brother Edward, or that she was plotting to advance her own claims to the throne. She carefully presented herself as a dutiful sister who wanted nothing more than to serve her brother the king and had no personal political ambitions whatsoever. The psychological pressure on Elizabeth during this period was enormous. She was isolated from her supporters, questioned repeatedly, and constantly reminded that her life hung in the balance. Several of her servants were also arrested and interrogated, adding to her sense of isolation and vulnerability. The teenage girl, who had already lost 2 mother figures and had her legitimacy questioned multiple times, was now facing the possibility of following in her biological mother's footsteps to the executioner's block. But Elizabeth's performance during this crisis revealed the steel beneath her careful, feminine exterior. She never broke, never contradicted herself, and never gave her interrogators the admissions they were seeking. Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, frustrated by his inability to break her, wrote to the Lord Protector that Elizabeth hath a very good wit, and nothing is gotten of her but by great policy. Elizabeth's survival of the Seymour crisis marked her true coming of age as a political player. She had faced down experienced interrogators, maintained her innocence under extreme pressure, and emerged with a reputation and position intact. More importantly, she had learned valuable lessons about the costs of romantic entanglement for a woman in her position. The execution of Thomas Seymour in March 1549 brought the crisis to an end, but it also marked the end of Elizabeth's youth in many ways. When asked for her reaction to Seymour's death, she supposedly replied, "This day died a man with much wit and very little judgment." The comment revealed both her intelligence and her growing emotional detachment. She had learned not to let personal feelings cloud her political judgment. The years that followed were relatively quiet for Elizabeth, but they were crucial in her development as a future ruler. She withdrew from court life, living quietly in her own household and focusing on her studies. She learned to present herself as a model of Protestant piety and feminine virtue, carefully crafting a public image that would protect her from future suspicions. During Edward II's reign, Elizabeth walked a careful line between maintaining her position in the succession and avoiding any appearance of ambition or disloyalty to her brother. She understood that as a potential heir, she was always under suspicion, always being watched for signs of treasonous ambition. Her strategy was to be so obviously virtuous, so clearly devoted to scholarship and prayer, that no one could question her loyalty or her intentions. This period also saw Elizabeth developing the intellectual and cultural interests that would later characterize her reign. She became an accomplished linguist, mastering Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and some Spanish. She studied theology, philosophy, and classical literature. She learned to play musical instruments and became known for her skill in dancing and conversation. All of these accomplishments were part of her political strategy, presenting herself as the ideal Renaissance princess, too devoted to scholarly pursuits to pose any political threat. But Elizabeth's careful strategy was about to be tested once again. When Edward VI died suddenly in 1553, the succession crisis that followed would force Elizabeth to navigate the most dangerous political waters of her life. The teenage girl who had survived the Seymour scandal was about to face challenges that would test every lesson she had learned about survival in the Tudor world. Edward's death at age 15 created a constitutional crisis that had been years in the making. Henry VIII's Third Succession Act had established that if Edward died without heirs, the crown would pass first to Mary and then to Elizabeth. But Edward's advisors, led by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, were determined to prevent the Catholic Mary from taking the throne and undoing the Protestant reforms of Edward's reign. Their solution was to install Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, as queen instead of Mary. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor, making her claim to the throne legitimate, if not as strong as Mary's. More importantly, she was Protestant, young, and married to Northumberland's son, making her a puppet who could be controlled by Edward's former advisors. For Elizabeth, Jane Grey's proclamation as queen presented an impossible dilemma. Supporting Jane would mean supporting Protestant religious policies she genuinely believed in, but it would also mean betraying her own claim to the throne and supporting what was essentially a military coup. Supporting Mary would mean accepting Catholic restoration, but it would also mean honoring the legitimate line of succession established by their father. Elizabeth's response to this crisis revealed her political genius even at age 19. Rather than committing herself to either side, she withdrew to her estates and waited to see which way the political winds would blow. When it became clear that Mary had the stronger support among the English people, Elizabeth rode to join her sister's cause, but not before the outcome was essentially decided. This calculated neutrality served Elizabeth well when Mary's victory became complete. Mary could hardly fault Elizabeth for ultimately supporting the legitimate succession, and Elizabeth's failure to actively support Jane Grey's regime meant that she avoided the treason charges that befell Jane's supporters. Once again, Elizabeth had navigated a deadly political crisis through careful calculation, rather than passionate commitment to any particular side. But Mary's accession to the throne created new challenges for Elizabeth. Mary was 13 years older than Elizabeth, and had spent most of her adult life watching Protestant reforms tear down everything she held sacred. She was determined to restore Catholic worship in England and to undo her father's break with Rome. For Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, and a symbol of Henry's rejection of Catherine of Aragon, Mary's reign represented a constant threat. The relationship between the half-sisters was complicated by their shared experiences as well as their religious differences. Both had been declared illegitimate. Both had seen their mothers destroyed by Henry's political necessities, and both understood the precarious nature of royal favour. But their religious differences made genuine closeness impossible, and Elizabeth's position as Protestant heir made her a natural focus for plots against Mary's Catholic regime. The most dangerous moment of Mary's reign for Elizabeth came in early 1554, when Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion aimed at preventing Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain. The rebellion was motivated by English fears that Mary's Spanish marriage would make England a mere province of the Spanish Empire, but it also attracted support from Protestants who hoped to replace Mary with Elizabeth. When the rebellion collapsed, Elizabeth once again found herself under suspicion of treason. Several of the rebels had mentioned her name during interrogations, and there were rumours that the plot had been designed to place her on the throne in Mary's place. For the second time in her life, Elizabeth faced the possibility of following her mother to the executioner's block, the Tower of London, where Elizabeth was imprisoned during the investigation, held particularly sinister associations for Anne Boleyn's daughter. It was here that her mother had spent her final weeks, here that she had been tried and condemned, here that she had died on a scaffold erected within the tower's walls. Elizabeth's imprisonment there was clearly intended to send a message about the price of treason, even suspected treason. But once again, Elizabeth's political skills saved her life. Under intense interrogation, she maintained her innocence with the same skill she had shown during the Seymour crisis. She acknowledged that rebels had mentioned her name but denied any knowledge of their plans or any encouragement of their actions. She presented herself as a loyal subject who had been used by treasonous men without her knowledge or consent. Elizabeth's survival of the Wyatt Rebellion investigation was aided by the lack of concrete evidence against her, but it was also a testament to her growing reputation for intelligence and integrity. Even Mary's advisors, who would have been glad to eliminate a potential rival, found it difficult to believe that Elizabeth would have been foolish enough to involve herself in such a poorly planned and obviously doomed rebellion. After 2 months in the Tower, Elizabeth was released to house arrest at Woodstock Palace. The conditions of her confinement were harsh. She was closely guarded, her correspondence was monitored, and she was allowed few visitors. But she was alive, and she had once again demonstrated her ability to survive the deadly games of Tudor politics. The years of Mary's reign were perhaps the most psychologically difficult of Elizabeth's life. She was constantly under suspicion, constantly watched for signs of disloyalty or heresy. She had to attend Catholic Mass regularly, despite her Protestant beliefs, and present a convincing appearance of religious conformity. The teenager, who had once been praised for her honest piety, now had to become skilled in religious dissimulation, perhaps most difficult of all. Elizabeth had to watch as Mary's religious policies tore England apart. The burnings of Protestant heretics that gave Mary the nickname Bloody Mary were particularly painful for Elizabeth, who saw former friends and supporters dying for beliefs she shared but could not openly express. The The political skills that had saved her life now forced her to watch silently as others died for their faith. But Elizabeth's patience and political calculation would ultimately be rewarded. Mary's reign, marked by religious persecution, economic troubles, and an unpopular foreign marriage, grew increasingly unpopular with the English people. As Mary aged without producing an heir, it became clear that Elizabeth would eventually inherit the throne she had risked so much to survive long enough to claim. When Mary died on November 17, 1558, Elizabeth was at Hatfield House, supposedly sitting under an oak tree reading when the news arrived. Whether or not the romantic story is true, Elizabeth's reaction to the news of her accession was carefully controlled. She had waited 25 years for this moment, had survived multiple attempts to destroy her, had sacrificed personal relationships and religious expression for the chance to rule England. As the lords of Mary's council knelt before their new queen, Elizabeth supposedly quoted from Psalm 118, "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes." But privately, she must have reflected on the dangerous game that had brought her to this moment. A game that had cost her mother's life, had threatened her own existence multiple times, and had taught her that survival in Tudor England required constant vigilance, perfect political calculation, and the ability to sacrifice personal desires for political necessity. The 25-year-old woman who became Queen Elizabeth I, on that November day in 1558, had been shaped by experiences that would have broken a weaker person. She had learned that love was dangerous, that trust was often fatal, and that survival required the ability to dissemble, calculate, and manipulate. These lessons, painful as they had been to learn, would serve her well in the decades to come. But first, she would have to prove that a woman could rule England successfully, that the dangerous game she had learned to play as a potential heir could be adapted to the even more dangerous game of actual rule. The girl, who had survived by being careful, quiet, and seemingly powerless, would now have to learn to wield power openly, while still maintaining the delicate balance that kept her alive and on the throne. The Virgin Queen's most dangerous game was about to begin. Elizabeth's ascension to the throne on November 17, 1558, marked the beginning of one of history's most fascinating political and personal dramas. At 25, she was no longer the carefully circumspect princess who had survived by avoiding attention. She was now Queen of England, with all the power and peril that title entailed. But the lessons of her perilous youth had taught her that in Tudor politics, love and power were dangerous companions, and the greatest threats often came from those closest to your heart. The England that Elizabeth inherited was a nation exhausted by religious conflict, weakened by foreign wars, and divided by the contradictory legacies of her predecessors. Henry VIII had broken with Rome, but left the country's religious settlement incomplete and unstable. Edward VI's Protestant reforms had been thorough but brief, lasting only 6 years before being overturned. Mary Ware's Catholic restoration had been marked by persecution and foreign entanglement, making her deeply unpopular by the time of her death. Elizabeth's first challenge was to establish a religious settlement that could bring peace to her divided realm. The solution she crafted was masterful in its political sophistication. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 represented neither the radical Protestantism of Edward's reign nor the militant Catholicism of Mary's restoration, but a carefully constructed middle path that would allow most English people to worship in good conscience. The Act of Supremacy restored Elizabeth as supreme governor of the Church of England. notably governor rather than head, a subtle concession to those who believed that Christ alone could head the church. The Act of Uniformity established a new Book of Common Prayer that was Protestant in theology, but retained enough traditional elements to avoid alienating moderate Catholics. Most cleverly, Elizabeth's settlement required outward conformity, but did not attempt to police private beliefs, recognizing that religious conviction could not be changed by parliamentary statute. This pragmatic approach to religion reflected Elizabeth's fundamental understanding of power, that it was more important to be obeyed than to be loved, but that obedience was more easily secured through compromise than through coercion. She had learned from her sister's failures that attempting to force religious change too rapidly only created resistance and instability. But if Elizabeth's approach to religious policy was cautious and moderate, the same could not be said for her approach to marriage and succession. Here, she would embark on the most dangerous game of her reign, using the promise of her hand in marriage as a diplomatic weapon, while carefully avoiding any commitment that might diminish her power or independence. The pressure on Elizabeth to marry began almost immediately upon her accession. Marriage was not just a personal matter for a queen regnant. It was a political necessity that affected the stability of the realm, the security of the succession, and England's relationships with foreign powers. Every unmarried queen was seen as an opportunity by neighbouring kingdoms to gain influence over England through marriage alliance. Elizabeth's Privy Council was unanimous in urging her to marry quickly and produce an heir. William Cecil, her chief advisor, presented her with detailed analyses of potential suitors, their political advantages, and the diplomatic benefits each marriage might bring. Parliament petitioned her repeatedly to choose a husband and secure the succession. Foreign ambassadors bombarded her with marriage proposals from their respective princes, but Elizabeth had learned from her predecessors' experiences that marriage could be as dangerous for a queen as remaining single. Mary the Roy's marriage to Philip II of Spain had made her deeply unpopular with her subjects and had subordinated English interest to Spanish policy. Even successful royal marriages created complications. Husbands expected to share power. Children created rival centres of loyalty, and foreign princes brought foreign obligations. More personally, Elizabeth had witnessed firsthand how marriage could destroy powerful women. Her mother's marriage to Henry VIII had ended with her execution. Catherine Parr's marriage to Thomas Seymour had created the scandal that nearly destroyed Elizabeth herself. Every stepmother she had known had either died in childbirth or been discarded when they became politically inconvenient. Elizabeth's solution was to transform the marriage question into a tool of statecraft, rather than rejecting marriage outright, which would have seemed unnatural and suspicious. She embraced the idea in principle while avoiding commitment in practice. She would encourage suitors, negotiate seriously with their representatives, and always leave open the possibility that the right offer might win her hand. This strategy required extraordinary political and emotional skill. Elizabeth had to appear genuinely interested in marriage, while never allowing negotiations to progress beyond her control. She had to maintain the fiction that she was actively seeking the husband, while carefully sabotaging any arrangement that might actually lead to marriage. Most challenging of all, she had to do this while managing her own genuine desires for love and companionship. The most dangerous aspect of Elizabeth's marriage game would prove to be her relationship with Robert Dudley, the man she had known since childhood. and who would remain the love of her life for nearly 30 years. If Elizabeth's public courtships were carefully orchestrated political theatre, her relationship with Dudley was something far more dangerous, a genuine passion that threatened to overwhelm her political judgment and destroy everything she had worked to achieve. Robert Dudley's return to Elizabeth's life in 1558 represented both her greatest happiness and her most dangerous vulnerability. They had known each other as children, had shared the terrifying experience of imprisonment in the Tower during Mary's reign, and had maintained a friendship despite the political obstacles that separated them during the 1550s, when Elizabeth became Queen. One of her first acts was to appoint Dudley as Master of the Horse, a position that required him to be constantly in her presence and gave him access to her private apartments. The attraction between Elizabeth and Dudley was immediate, intense, and obvious to everyone at court. Contemporary observers noted that the Queen seemed transformed when Dudley was present, more animated, more playful, more openly happy than anyone had ever seen her. They danced together for hours, rode out together daily, and spent long evenings in private conversation. The Spanish ambassador reported that Elizabeth visited Dudley in his chambers day and night, a scandalous breach of protocol that set tongues wagging across Europe. For Elizabeth, who had spent her entire life carefully controlling her public image, this open display of affection was completely out of character. The woman who had survived multiple interrogations, who had learned to dissemble about her deepest beliefs, who had mastered the art of political theatre, seemed incapable of hiding her feelings for Robert Dudley. The intensity of their relationship created immediate political problems. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments that the Queen of England was behaving like a lovesick girl rather than a serious ruler. Marriage negotiations with foreign princes stalled because no one believed Elizabeth was genuinely interested in anyone except Dudley. Parliament grew increasingly concerned about the succession, worried that Elizabeth's infatuation might lead her to make a politically disastrous marriage, or worse, to have illegitimate children. But the greatest obstacle to Elizabeth's happiness was not political opposition. It was the fact that Robert Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, lived quietly on their estate in the countryside, rarely appearing at court and seemingly forgotten by most observers. But her existence made Elizabeth's relationship with Dudley technically adulterous and politically impossible. The situation created an extraordinary psychological tension for Elizabeth. For the first time in her life, she was genuinely, passionately in love. Dudley represented everything she had been denied: the possibility of a normal romantic relationship, the chance to share her burdens with someone she trusted completely, the prospect of physical and emotional intimacy. With him, she could be Elizabeth the woman rather than Elizabeth the Queen. But loving Dudley also meant living with constant awareness of the impossible nature of their situation. She could never marry him while Amy lived, and even if Amy died naturally, the political costs of marrying Dudley would be enormous. Foreign powers would see such a marriage as a sign that England was not serious about international alliances. Her own nobles would resent being ruled by someone they considered a mere courtier elevated above his station. The psychological stress of this impossible love began to show in Elizabeth's behavior. She became increasingly temperamental, subject to sudden rages followed by periods of melancholy. She began suffering from what were described as fits of the mother, probably what we would now recognize as anxiety attacks. The Queen, who had always prided herself on emotional control, was becoming erratic and unpredictable. The crisis came to a head on September 8, 1560, when Amy Robsart was found dead at the bottom of a staircase at Cumnor Place, her neck broken from what appeared to be a fall. The circumstances of Amy's death were immediately suspicious. She had been in apparent good health. The servants had been sent away from the house that day, and her death came at a moment when it would be extraordinarily convenient for both Elizabeth and Robert. Rumours of murder spread immediately. Popular gossip held that Dudley had arranged his wife's death to clear the way for marriage to the Queen. More sophisticated observers suspected that Elizabeth herself might have ordered Amy's death, or at least known about Dudley's plans. The scandal reverberated across Europe, with foreign ambassadors reporting that the Queen of England was suspected of complicity in murder. For Elizabeth, Amy's death represented both opportunity and disaster. On one hand, the legal obstacle to her marriage with Dudley had been removed. She was now free to marry the man she loved. On the other hand, doing so would inevitably be seen as confirmation that she had been involved in Amy's death. Marriage to Dudley would transform Elizabeth from a queen suspected of adultery into a queen suspected of murder. The political implications were staggering. Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's Catholic rival, immediately began claiming that Elizabeth's suspected involvement in Amy's death proved she was unfit to rule. Catholic propagandists across Europe portrayed Elizabeth as a murderess and usurper whose very presence on the throne was an affront to Christian morality. Even Protestant allies expressed concern about the scandal's impact on Elizabeth's reputation and England's international standing. Elizabeth's response to the crisis revealed both her political sophistication and her emotional devastation. Publicly, she insisted on a thorough investigation into Amy's death, even though such an investigation might uncover evidence damaging to herself. She temporarily sent Dudley away from court, demonstrating that she was not allowing personal feelings to override proper procedure. She maintained her composure during official functions, showing no sign of the emotional turmoil she must have been experiencing. But privately, Elizabeth was shattered. The love of her life was now associated with scandal and suspected murder. Marriage to him had become politically impossible, but giving him up entirely was emotionally unbearable. She had reached the point where her personal happiness and her political survival were in direct conflict, forcing her to choose between love and duty. The coroner's inquest into Amy's death returned a verdict of accidental death, but this legal finding did little to quiet the rumours or repair the damage to Elizabeth's reputation. Modern historians generally agree that Amy's death was probably accidental. She may have suffered from breast cancer, which could have weakened her bones and made a fatal fall more likely. But the suspicious circumstances and convenient timing meant that questions would linger for decades. Elizabeth's handling of the aftermath of Amy's death demonstrated her growing mastery of political theatre. She allowed Dudley to return to court, but not to his former position of obvious favour. She continued their relationship, but more discreetly, avoiding the public displays of affection that had caused so much comment before Amy's death. She kept alive the possibility of marriage to Dudley, while pursuing marriage negotiations with other suitors, maintaining the fiction that all options remained open. But the damage to their relationship was permanent and profound. The spontaneous joy and open affection that had characterized their early interactions was replaced by something more careful and controlled. Elizabeth had learned that even her private emotions could have devastating public consequences. and she would never again allow herself to be so vulnerable. The years following Amy's death saw Elizabeth and Dudley locked in a complex dance of approach and withdrawal. Elizabeth would encourage him with private tokens of affection, only to humiliate him publicly by flirting with other men. Dudley would threaten to leave court and marry someone else, only to return when Elizabeth showed signs of genuine distress at his absence. In 1562, Elizabeth fell seriously ill with smallpox and seemed likely to die. In what she believed might be her final moments, she made her counsellors promise to give Dudley an enormous pension, £20,000 a year, and swore that although she loved him dearly, nothing unseemly had ever passed between them. This deathbed declaration was both a testament to their love and a recognition of its impossible nature. Elizabeth's recovery from smallpox marked another turning point in her relationship with Dudley. She had faced the possibility of death without an heir, forcing her to confront the reality that her personal desires might have to be permanently subordinated to political necessity. She began to speak more seriously about marriage to foreign princes, while maintaining Dudley as a sort of emotional refuge from the pressures of these political negotiations. In 1564, Elizabeth elevated Dudley to Earl of Leicester, ostensibly to make him a suitable husband for Mary Queen of Scots, a matchmaking scheme so bizarre that it could only have been devised by someone trying to keep her beloved close while avoiding marriage to him herself. The plan, predictably, came to nothing, but it demonstrated Elizabeth's creative approaches to managing the impossible situation her love had created. While Elizabeth's relationship with Robert Dudley represented her most genuine emotional attachment, it was her courtships with foreign princes that demonstrated her true genius for political theatre. Over the course of her reign, she would entertain serious marriage negotiations with suitors from across Europe, using the promise of her hand as a diplomatic weapon, while never quite allowing any negotiation to reach its conclusion. The first major foreign courtship of Elizabeth's reign involved Eric IX of Sweden, a match that might have provided England with a useful Protestant ally in Northern Europe. Elizabeth allowed the negotiations to continue for several years, encouraged by the diplomatic benefits the alliance might bring, and by Eric's apparent willingness to accept a subordinate role in the marriage. But Elizabeth's handling of the Swedish courtship revealed the fundamental problem she faced in all her marriage negotiations. She needed to appear genuinely interested in marriage to maintain her diplomatic advantages, but she also needed to avoid any commitment that might actually lead to marriage. Her solution was to raise increasingly elaborate requirements and conditions, making it gradually clear that no foreign prince would find marriage to her worth the costs she would demand. With Eric IV, Elizabeth insisted that any marriage contract must guarantee that she would remain Queen of England in her own right, that her husband would have no independent authority over English affairs, and that England would not be required to support Swedish interests that conflicted with English policy. These conditions were so restrictive that they essentially made marriage impossible, while allowing Elizabeth to claim that she was not rejecting marriage, but simply protecting English interests. The most significant and dangerous of Elizabeth's foreign courtships was her long negotiation with the Archduke Charles of Austria, a match that would have allied England with the Habsburg Empire and might have provided the male heir that everyone expected her to produce. Charles was young, reasonably attractive, and willing to make significant concessions to English religious and political requirements. The Austrian courtship lasted for nearly a decade, and at times seemed genuinely likely to succeed. Elizabeth appeared to take the negotiations seriously, engaging in detailed discussions about religious compromises, financial arrangements, and the Archduke's role in English government. She even allowed Charles's representatives to believe that she was willing to allow him some private Catholic worship, a concession that would have been scandalous if it had become public knowledge. But Elizabeth's private comments about the Austrian match reveal her true feelings about marriage. She confided to her closest advisors that she found the idea of sharing her authority with any man deeply disturbing, that she worried about the physical dangers of childbirth, and that she had seen too many examples of marriages that had destroyed rather than strengthened the women involved. The collapse of the Austrian negotiations in 1567 marked a turning point in European perceptions of Elizabeth's marriage ability. At 34, she was approaching the age where childbearing became more dangerous and less likely to be successful. Foreign princes began to question whether she was genuinely interested in marriage or was simply using marriage negotiations as a diplomatic tool, while having no intention of ever actually marrying. Elizabeth's response to these changing perceptions was to embark on her most audacious and dangerous courtship yet, her pursuit of François, Duke of Anjou, brother to the King of France. The Anjou courtship was remarkable, both for its diplomatic significance and for the genuine emotion Elizabeth seemed to develop for her suitor, despite their 20-year age difference and the obvious political obstacles to their union. Anjou was young, charming, and genuinely interested in Elizabeth both as a woman and as a potential path to greater power. Unlike previous suitors who had approached Elizabeth primarily for diplomatic reasons, Anjou seemed to enjoy her company and to appreciate her intelligence and wit. For Elizabeth, who was now in her 40s and increasingly isolated by her royal position, Anjou's obvious attraction to her was both flattering and emotionally moving. The French courtship lasted for nearly 4 years, and at times seemed genuinely likely to result in marriage. Elizabeth called Anjou her frog, and wore his ring publicly, causing speculation that she had secretly agreed to marry him. She wrote him passionate letters and seemed to suffer genuine distress when political obstacles arose to separate them. But the Anjou courtship also revealed the fundamental impossibility of Elizabeth's position. Her subjects were horrified by the prospect of a French Catholic consort, seeing such a marriage as a betrayal of England's Protestant identity and independence. Parliament petitioned against the match, preachers denounced it from their pulpits, and popular pamphlets predicted disaster if the marriage went forward. The crisis came to a head in 1579 when John Stubbs published The Discovery of a Gaping Gulf, a pamphlet that attacked the proposed French marriage in the most violent terms, predicting that it would lead to England's conquest by France and the restoration of Catholicism. Elizabeth's response was swift and brutal. She had Stubbs and his publisher arrested and their right hands cut off for sedition. But even as she punished opposition to the marriage, Elizabeth was forced to confront the reality that her subjects would never accept Anjou as their king. The woman who had spent her entire reign carefully maintaining her subjects' loyalty was faced with the possibility that marriage might cost her their allegiance. Once again, love and political necessity were in direct conflict. The end of the Anjou courtship in 1582 marked the effective end of Elizabeth's marriageable years. At 49, she was beyond the age where childbearing was realistic, removing the succession argument that had driven much of the pressure for her to marry. She was free from the burden of constant marriage negotiations, but she was also condemned to permanent solitude. Elizabeth's handling of the marriage question over nearly 25 years represented a masterpiece of political manipulation, but it also exacted a tremendous personal cost. She had used the promise of marriage to maintain diplomatic flexibility and domestic stability, but she had also condemned herself to a life without the companionship and intimacy that marriage might have provided. The title Virgin Queen that became associated with Elizabeth was both a celebration of her independence and a recognition of her sacrifice. She had chosen duty over love, political necessity over personal happiness, and the good of her realm over her own desires. But the choice had not been made easily or without cost. Throughout her marriage negotiations, Elizabeth maintained her emotional relationship with Robert Dudley, now Earl of Leicester. He remained her closest confidant, the person who understood her best and provided the emotional support she needed to endure the pressures of her position. But their relationship was also marked by jealousy, manipulation, and the constant awareness that it could never be fully consummated. The dangerous game of love that Elizabeth played throughout her reign was perhaps her greatest political triumph and her deepest personal tragedy. She had used her sexuality and marriageability as tools of statecraft while avoiding the trap that marriage represented for queens regnant. But she had also sentenced herself to emotional isolation, surrounding herself with the forms of love while being denied its substance. The Virgin Queen's mastery of the dangerous game of love would become legendary, inspiring countless stories and myths about her relationships with her courtiers. But behind the legend was a woman who had learned that for a queen, love was the most dangerous game of all, one that could destroy everything she had worked to achieve, even as its absence condemned her to a life of magnificent loneliness. As Elizabeth entered the 1570s, having survived the treacherous early years of her reign and established herself as a formidable political operator, she faced new challenges that would test her skills in ways she had never imagined. The comfortable fiction that England could remain neutral in Europe's religious wars was becoming impossible to maintain, and Elizabeth would be forced to make decisions that stained her hands with blood and haunted her conscience for the rest of her life. The papal bull, Regnans in Excelsis, issued by Pope Pius V in 1570, transformed Elizabeth's reign from a domestic political challenge into an international religious war. With a stroke of his pen, the Pope declared Elizabeth a heretic and usurper, released all English Catholics from their allegiance to her, and effectively called for her overthrow. The bull made every Catholic in England a potential traitor, and every Catholic ruler in Europe a potential invader. The psychological impact of the papal bull on Elizabeth was profound. She had spent the first 12 years of her reign trying to create a moderate religious settlement that would allow Catholics and Protestants to coexist peacefully in England. She had avoided the religious extremism that had marked her predecessors' reigns, offering Catholics a place in English society as long as they demonstrated outward conformity to the established church. The Pope's declaration shattered this carefully constructed compromise. Catholics could no longer claim to be loyal subjects who simply held different religious beliefs. The highest authority in their church had declared loyalty to Elizabeth incompatible with their faith. Elizabeth was forced to accept that she was engaged in an existential religious conflict, whether she wanted to be or not. The immediate practical consequence of the papal bull was to place English Catholics in an impossible position. They could remain loyal to Elizabeth and face excommunication from their church, or they could remain faithful to Rome and face charges of treason from their government. Many English Catholics tried to find a middle path, maintaining their religious beliefs privately while demonstrating public loyalty to the crown. But this became increasingly difficult as the religious conflict intensified. Elizabeth's response to the papal bull revealed both her political sophistication and her genuine reluctance to persecute her subjects for their religious beliefs. Rather than launching an immediate campaign against all Catholics, she chose to focus her attention on those who posed active political threats while leaving private Catholics alone as much as possible. The distinction she drew was between Catholics who practiced their religion quietly and those who actively worked to overthrow her government. Seminary priests who entered England to minister to Catholic communities were arrested and executed, but Catholic laypeople who attended Protestant services and avoided political activity were generally left unmolested. This policy allowed Elizabeth to claim that she was executing traitors rather than martyrs, political criminals rather than religious believers. But the distinction between religious belief and political action became increasingly difficult to maintain as Catholic opposition to Elizabeth's rule intensified. The arrival of seminary priests trained in continental seminaries brought new energy to English Catholic communities, but it also brought new surveillance and suspicion from Elizabeth's government. Every Catholic priest was assumed to be a potential assassin. Every Catholic layman a potential conspirator. The paranoia was not entirely unjustified. Throughout the 1570s and 1580s, Elizabeth's government uncovered a series of Catholic plots against her life and throne. These conspiracies range from half-baked schemes by religious enthusiasts to sophisticated operations backed by foreign governments. Each discovered plot reinforced the government's conviction that Catholicism and treason were synonymous, leading to increasingly harsh measures against Catholic communities. Elizabeth's personal feelings about religious persecution were complex and painful. She had grown up during Mary's reign, watching Protestant martyrs die for their faith, and she had promised herself that her own reign would be marked by religious tolerance rather than persecution. But the reality of governing a Protestant nation surrounded by Catholic enemies made such tolerance seem like dangerous naivety. The Queen, who had once boasted that she would not make windows into men's souls, was forced to do exactly that, as her government developed an extensive intelligence network designed to monitor Catholic activities. Francis Walsingham, her Secretary of State and Spy Master, created what was arguably the most sophisticated intelligence service in Europe, with agents throughout England and across the continent reporting on Catholic plots and conspiracies. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was enormous for Elizabeth. She had to live with the knowledge that many of her subjects wished her dead, that foreign powers were actively working to overthrow her, and that even seemingly innocent religious activities might conceal deadly political conspiracies. The woman who had once enjoyed walking among her people and appearing at public ceremonies without heavy security was forced to accept increasing isolation and protection. The most painful aspect of the Catholic threat for Elizabeth was its impact on her relationship with her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary's presence in England since 1568 had been a source of constant anxiety, but the papal bull transformed her from an inconvenient guest into a mortal enemy. As a Catholic queen with a legitimate claim to the English throne, Mary became the natural focus for every Catholic plot against Elizabeth's rule. The 19 years that Mary Queen of Scots spent in English captivity represented one of the most complex and tragic relationships in Tudor history. The two queens were cousins, sharing a great-grandfather in Henry VII, but they were also religious and political enemies whose very existence threatened each other's security. Elizabeth's handling of the Mary problem would prove to be one of the most difficult and morally ambiguous challenges of her entire reign. Mary had arrived in England in 1568 as a refugee, fleeing the Scottish lords, who had forced her to abdicate in favour of her infant son James VI. She came seeking Elizabeth's help in regaining her throne, confident that one queen would support another against rebellious subjects. But Elizabeth's response to Mary's arrival was cautious and calculating rather than sympathetic and supportive. From Elizabeth's perspective, Mary represented an unsolvable problem. As an anointed queen, Mary deserved support against her rebellious subjects, but as a Catholic with a claim to the English throne, she was a natural magnet for Catholic conspiracies. Helping Mary regain the Scottish throne might restore legitimate monarchy in Scotland, but it would also place a Catholic queen on England's northern border. Refusing to help Mary was a betrayal of royal solidarity, but supporting her was a potential threat to English security. Elizabeth's solution was characteristically complex and morally ambiguous. She would neither help Mary regain her throne, nor allow her to leave England to seek help elsewhere. Instead, Mary would remain in comfortable but secure captivity, treated with the respect due to a queen, but watched constantly for signs of treasonous activity. The decision to hold Mary prisoner was politically shrewd, but ethically questionable. Elizabeth was imprisoning a fellow queen who had committed no crime against England and whose only offence was to pose a potential threat to English interests. The precedent was dangerous. If queens could imprison each other based on potential rather than actual threats, the entire concept of royal legitimacy was undermined. For Mary, the years of captivity were a slow torture of frustrated ambition and diminishing hope. She had been a queen since she was 6 days old, had ruled Scotland in her own right, and had been Queen of France through her marriage to the Dauphin. Confinement in English castles, however comfortable, was a devastating blow to a woman accustomed to wielding real power. Mary's response to captivity was to involve herself in increasingly desperate schemes to regain her freedom and her throne. Cut off from normal political activity, she became involved in a series of conspiracies designed to overthrow Elizabeth and place herself on the English throne. Each plot made her situation more dangerous and Elizabeth's position more difficult. The first major conspiracy involving Mary was the Ridolfi plot of 1571, which aimed to assassinate Elizabeth, marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk, and place them jointly on the English throne with Spanish military support. The plot was uncovered by Walsingham's agents, leading to Norfolk's execution and increased restrictions on Mary's activities. Elizabeth's response to the Ridolfi plot revealed both her political pragmatism and her personal reluctance to execute fellow royalty. While she agreed to Norfolk's execution, he was, after all, one of her own subjects who had committed obvious treason. She refused Parliament's demand that Mary be tried and executed as well. Elizabeth understood the dangerous precedent that executing an anointed queen would set, and she was unwilling to cross that line unless absolutely necessary. But each new plot involving Mary made Elizabeth's position more difficult. Her Parliament and Privy Council argued increasingly forcefully that Mary's continued existence was incompatible with Elizabeth's safety. As long as Mary lived, she would remain a focus for Catholic conspiracies and a potential alternative ruler for discontented subjects. The only permanent solution to the Mary problem was her death, but Elizabeth recoiled from authorizing the execution of a fellow queen. The psychological burden of the Mary situation weighed heavily on Elizabeth throughout the 1570s and early 1580s. She was responsible for the welfare of a woman who was both her guest and her prisoner, her cousin and her enemy. Mary's letters to Elizabeth during this period are heartbreaking in their appeals to family loyalty and royal solidarity, but they were also manipulative attempts to gain freedom that could be used against English interests. Elizabeth's own letters about Mary reveal the genuine anguish the situation caused her. She recognized Mary's royal dignity and felt guilty about her imprisonment, but she also understood that Mary's freedom might lead to civil war or foreign invasion. The woman who had mastered the art of political calculation found herself in a situation where every option was morally compromised and politically dangerous. The crisis that would finally force Elizabeth's hand came in 1586 with the discovery of the Babington Plot, the most serious and well-organized conspiracy yet uncovered. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman, had organized a group of conspirators who planned to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and place her on the English throne with Spanish support. What made the Babington Plot different from previous conspiracies was the clear evidence of Mary's direct involvement. Walsingham's agents had intercepted and decoded Mary's correspondence with the conspirators, including letters in which she explicitly approved plans for Elizabeth's assassination. For the first time, there was unambiguous proof that Mary was not just a passive focus for conspiracies, but an active participant in treason. The discovery of Mary's letters sealed her fate, but Elizabeth's response was still agonized and reluctant. She understood that Mary's execution was now politically necessary. The evidence of treason was too clear to ignore, and her subjects would never forgive her if she allowed Mary to live after approving plans for Elizabeth's murder. But she also understood that executing Mary would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The trial of Mary Queen of Scots in October 1586 was a strange and unprecedented proceeding. Mary refused to recognize the court's authority, arguing that as a sovereign queen, she could not be tried by English subjects. She denied the charges against her and maintained her innocence even when confronted with copies of her own letters. The legal and constitutional questions raised by the trial were complex and would influence discussions of royal immunity for centuries to come. Mary's defense was legally sophisticated but politically doomed. She argued that she had never been Elizabeth's subject and therefore could not commit treason against her, that the evidence against her was fabricated or taken out of context, and that her correspondence with conspirators was not proof of treasonous intent. But the court was less interested in legal niceties than in political necessity, and Mary's conviction was a foregone conclusion. Elizabeth's reaction to Mary's conviction was a masterpiece of psychological complexity and political theatre. She genuinely agonized over the decision to sign Mary's death warrant, spending months in what her counselors described as an agony of indecision. She signed the warrant several times only to withdraw it, consulted with theologians and lawyers about the morality and legality of executing a fellow queen, and desperately sought alternatives that might resolve the situation without bloodshed. But Elizabeth's hesitation was also politically calculated. By appearing reluctant to execute Mary, she demonstrated to Catholic Europe that she took no pleasure in Mary's death and had been forced to act by Mary's own treasonous behavior. She was positioning herself as a reluctant executioner rather than a vindictive enemy hoping to minimize the international backlash that Mary's death would inevitably provoke. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots on February the 8th, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle was one of the most dramatic and politically significant events of Elizabeth's reign. Mary faced death with remarkable courage and dignity, presenting herself as a Catholic martyr dying for her faith, rather than a traitor paying for her crimes. Her final speech and behavior on the scaffold were carefully calculated to create maximum sympathy for her cause and maximum embarrassment for Elizabeth. Elizabeth's immediate response to news of Mary's execution was fury directed at her counsellors, who had sent the warrant without her explicit final approval. She imprisoned William Davison, the secretary who had delivered the warrant, and temporarily banished Lord Burghley, her closest advisor, from court. This reaction was partly genuine. Elizabeth was horrified that the irrevocable step had been taken, but it was also political theatre designed to distance her from responsibility for Mary's death. The aftermath of Mary's execution created exactly the international crisis that Elizabeth had feared. Philip II of Spain used Mary's death as justification for launching the Great Armada against England, arguing that he was avenging the murder of a Catholic queen and claiming the English throne through his own tenuous hereditary rights. Catholic propaganda throughout Europe portrayed Elizabeth as a regicide and usurper who had finally revealed her true nature. But the domestic reaction to Mary's execution was overwhelmingly positive. English Protestants celebrated the removal of the Catholic threat and praised Elizabeth for finally taking decisive action against her enemies. Parliament thanked her for eliminating the focus of Catholic conspiracies, and popular celebrations throughout England demonstrated that most of her subjects approved of Mary's death. For Elizabeth personally, Mary's execution marked a profound psychological turning point. She had crossed the line she had never wanted to cross, authorizing the death of a fellow queen and accepting the moral responsibility that came with that decision. The woman who had spent her entire reign trying to avoid the religious extremism of her predecessors had been forced to commit an act that would be remembered as one of the defining moments of the European religious wars. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots provided Philip II of Spain with the excuse he had been seeking to launch a full-scale invasion of England. Throughout the 1570s and early 1580s, Anglo-Spanish relations had deteriorated steadily as Elizabeth's government supported Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and English privateers attacked Spanish treasure fleets returning from the Americas. Mary's death transformed this Cold War into open conflict. Philip's decision to invade England was motivated by religious, political, and personal factors. As the most powerful Catholic ruler in Europe, he felt obligated to avenge Mary's death and restore Catholicism to England. Politically, conquering England would eliminate the primary source of support for the Dutch rebellion and secure Spanish dominance in Western Europe. Personally, Philip had been married to Elizabeth's sister Mary and had once been considered as a potential husband for Elizabeth herself. England's defiance of Spanish power was a personal as well as political affront. The preparation of the Spanish Armada represented the largest military undertaking of the 16th century. Philip assembled over 130 ships carrying approximately 30,000 men, supported by additional forces in the Netherlands under the command of the Duke of Parma. The fleet included massive galleons designed for fighting at close quarters, along with supply ships, troop transports, and smaller vessels for communication and reconnaissance. Elizabeth's response to the Spanish threat demonstrated her mastery of both military strategy and political propaganda. She understood that England's best defence lay not in matching Spain's massive fleet, ship for ship, but in using England's advantages in seamanship, gunnery, and knowledge of local waters to disrupt Spanish plans and inflict maximum damage on the invasion force. The appointment of Lord Howard of Effingham as Lord High Admiral was a stroke of political genius. Howard was an experienced courtier and administrator, rather than a professional sailor, but his aristocratic status gave him the authority to command respect from England's fractious naval commanders. More importantly, he was wise enough to defer to the expertise of professionals like Francis Drake, while maintaining overall strategic control. Drake's preemptive strike on Cadiz in 1587 had already demonstrated English naval capabilities and disrupted Spanish preparations. The raid destroyed numerous ships under construction and delayed the Armada's departure by at least a year. More psychologically important, it showed that English sea dogs could strike at Spanish ports with impunity, challenging the myth of Spanish invincibility. When the Armada finally appeared off the English coast in July 1588, Elizabeth's response was characteristically theatrical and inspiring. Her visit to the army assembled at Tilbury, where she delivered her famous speech declaring that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, became one of the most memorable moments of her reign. The speech at Tilbury was political theatre at its finest, but it was also genuine leadership in a moment of national crisis. Elizabeth appeared before her troops dressed in white velvet and silver armour, carrying a silver truncheon and riding a white horse. The image was carefully calculated to present her as both a warrior queen and a divine protector of England, combining military strength with feminine grace in a way that inspired her soldiers and demonstrated her unique approach to royal authority. But Elizabeth's real contribution to England's defence lay not in military spectacle, but in her political and strategic leadership throughout the crisis. She had spent months preparing for the invasion, ensuring that adequate supplies reached the fleet, that coastal defences were strengthened, and that the intelligence network provided accurate information about Spanish movements. Her combination of careful preparation and inspiring leadership proved more valuable than any military prowess she might have possessed. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was achieved through a combination of English naval skill, favourable weather, and Spanish strategic miscalculations, rather than any single decisive battle. The English fleet harassed the Spanish formation as it moved up the channel, using superior gunnery and manoeuvrability to inflict damage while avoiding the close combat that would have favoured Spanish tactics. The crucial moment came when the Armada anchored at Calais, waiting to rendezvous with Parma's army in the Netherlands. Howard and Drake launched fireships into the Spanish formation, forcing the fleet to cut its anchor cables and scatter. In the confusion that followed, the English fleet was able to attack individual Spanish ships and inflict serious damage on the invasion force. But it was the weather, rather than English naval action, that ultimately destroyed the Armada as an effective fighting force. Storms scattered the Spanish fleet as it attempted to return to Spain by sailing around Scotland and Ireland. Ships were wrecked on rocky coasts, crews died of disease and starvation, and the remnants of Philip's great fleet limped home, having achieved none of their objectives. Elizabeth's response to the victory was characteristically complex, combining genuine relief and celebration with careful political calculation. The defeat of the Armada was presented as divine intervention on behalf of Protestant England, with commemorative medals bearing the inscription, "He blew with his winds, and they were scattered." Elizabeth positioned herself as God's chosen instrument for England's defence, reinforcing her religious and political authority through military victory. But Elizabeth also understood that the Armada's defeat was not the end of the Spanish threat, but simply the failure of one particular invasion attempt. Philip II would rebuild his fleet and launch additional expeditions throughout the 1590s, forcing Elizabeth to maintain expensive naval defences and continue the exhausting struggle against Spanish power. The financial cost of the naval war was enormous and would plague Elizabeth's government for the rest of her reign. England's victory had been achieved partly through the voluntary service of English sailors and the private investment of merchants and courtiers in naval expeditions. Maintaining permanent defences against future Spanish attacks required resources that England's relatively small economy could barely provide. More personally, the Armada crisis marked a turning point in Elizabeth's relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Leicester had commanded the army at Tilbury and had shared in the triumph of England's victory, but his health was failing, and he would die just weeks after the Armada's defeat. For Elizabeth, victory over her greatest external enemy was overshadowed by the loss of her closest personal friend and confidant. Leicester's death in September 1588 left Elizabeth more isolated than she had ever been in her 30-year reign. The man who had been her constant companion, her emotional refuge, and her closest advisor was gone, leaving her to face the challenges of her later years without the personal support that had sustained her through earlier crises. The triumph over the Spanish Armada marked the high point of Elizabeth's reign, but it also ushered in a period of increasing difficulty and moral compromise. The 1590s would see Elizabeth forced to make decisions that contradicted her earlier principles and stained her reputation with acts of violence and oppression that she had once hoped to avoid. The most troubling aspect of Elizabeth's later reign was her handling of the Irish rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. Ireland had been a source of constant difficulty throughout Elizabeth's reign, but the 9 Years' War, 1594-1603, would prove to be the most brutal and destructive conflict of her entire period of rule. Elizabeth's Irish policy was shaped by the same religious and political pressures that influenced her approach to domestic Catholicism. Ireland was overwhelmingly Catholic and therefore seen as a potential base for Spanish invasion or Catholic rebellion. The Irish nobility's traditional independence from English control was viewed as a threat to English security, rather than a legitimate assertion of native rights. The suppression of the Irish rebellion involved tactics that were brutal even by 16th century standards. English forces systematically destroyed crops and livestock, creating artificial famines designed to starve the Irish population into submission. Entire regions were depopulated, and contemporary estimates suggest that the Irish population declined by as much as 1/3 during the conflict. Elizabeth's personal involvement in these policies was extensive and deliberate. She approved the appointment of commanders known for their ruthless methods, authorized the use of starvation as a weapon of war, and refused to consider negotiated settlements that might have reduced the suffering of the Irish population. The Queen, who had once prided herself on religious moderation, was presiding over what amounted to genocide. The psychological impact of the Irish War on Elizabeth was profound, but carefully hidden from public view. She understood the moral implications of her policies and struggled with the contradiction between her desire to be remembered as a merciful ruler and the harsh realities of maintaining English control over Ireland. Her correspondence during this period reveals a woman increasingly burdened by the weight of decisions that contradicted her earlier values. But Elizabeth's approach to Ireland was also influenced by genuine strategic concerns that went beyond religious prejudice or imperial ambition. Spanish support for Irish rebels posed a real threat to English security, and the possibility of a Spanish invasion force landing in Ireland was a constant source of anxiety for Elizabeth's government. The brutal suppression of Irish resistance was seen as necessary to prevent England itself from being invaded. The financial cost of the Irish War was enormous and contributed to the economic difficulties that marked Elizabeth's final years. The conflict consumed resources that England could ill afford, forced Elizabeth to sell crown lands to finance military operations, and created debts that would burden her successor. The Queen, who had once boasted of England's fiscal responsibility, was leaving behind a treasury depleted by decades of warfare. Perhaps most troubling for Elizabeth was the way the Irish War corrupted many of the young men she had hoped would carry on the achievements of her reign. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex and stepson of her beloved Leicester, was one of several promising courtiers whose careers were destroyed by the demands of Irish service. The idealism and honour that Elizabeth valued in her courtiers were gradually eroded by the brutal realities of colonial warfare. The domestic consequences of Elizabeth's later policies were also increasingly troubling. The network of informants and surveillance that had been created to monitor Catholic activities gradually expanded to watch all potentially disloyal subjects. The England of Elizabeth's final years was becoming a police state, where private correspondence was routinely intercepted, where casual comments could be construed as treason, and where the boundaries between legitimate religious belief and seditious activity were increasingly unclear. Elizabeth's handling of religious dissent in her later years revealed the gradual hardening of attitudes that had once been characterized by relative tolerance. The execution of Catholic priests became routine, and the penalties for harboring them or participating in Catholic worship were steadily increased. The Queen, who had once declared that she would not make windows into men's souls, was presiding over exactly the kind of religious persecution she had once deplored. The economic policies of Elizabeth's later reign also reflected the growing pressures of constant warfare and financial strain. The sale of monopolies to favoured courtiers created artificial scarcities and inflated prices for common goods, causing genuine hardship for ordinary English people. The tax burden increased steadily throughout the 1590s, and Elizabeth was forced to demand subsidies from Parliament with increasing frequency. Perhaps most damaging to Elizabeth's long-term reputation was her growing reliance on favourites whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned through merit or genuine affection. The court culture of her final years was characterized by factionalism, corruption, and the kind of arbitrary favoritism that she had once criticized in her predecessors. The contrast between the idealistic young queen, who had promised to serve her people's interests above her own, and the aging monarch presiding over religious persecution, colonial brutality, and domestic oppression, was stark and painful. Elizabeth was aware of this contradiction and struggled with the gap between her early aspirations and the harsh realities of her later policies. But Elizabeth's later compromises were also the product of circumstances beyond her control. The international religious war that followed the papal bull of 1570 had forced her to choose between survival and principle, and she had consistently chosen survival. The Spanish threat had required military responses that consumed resources and corrupted ideals. The Irish rebellion had demanded brutal solutions that contradicted her early hopes for merciful governance. The dangerous game that Elizabeth had played throughout her reign, balancing competing pressures while maintaining her independence and authority, was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The flexibility and compromise that had served her well in earlier crises were becoming sources of moral compromise and political weakness, as the challenges she faced grew more complex and the stakes higher. By the time Elizabeth entered the final decade of her reign, she was no longer the inspiring young queen who had defeated the Spanish Armada and brought peace to a divided nation. She was an aging woman burdened by the accumulated weight of 40 years of difficult decisions, surrounded by courtiers whose loyalty was questionable and presiding over policies that contradicted many of her deepest values. The Virgin Queen's dangerous game was entering its final phase, and the costs of playing that game were becoming increasingly apparent, both to Elizabeth herself and to the subjects who had once celebrated her as their deliverer from tyranny and foreign domination. As Elizabeth entered the 1590s, the contradictions of her reign became increasingly apparent. While poets and playwrights celebrated the Elizabethan Golden Age, the reality of governing England had forced the Queen into moral compromises that sat uneasily with her carefully crafted public image. The woman who had once embodied hope and renewal was now presiding over a nation exhausted by war, divided by religious extremism, and burdened by the very success that had made her reign legendary. The flowering of English culture during Elizabeth's reign was both genuine achievement and carefully orchestrated propaganda. The emergence of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and dozens of other literary figures was not accidental. It was the product of a deliberate royal policy designed to create a distinctly English cultural identity that could compete with the achievements of continental Europe. Elizabeth's support for the arts was both personal passion and political necessity. She genuinely loved music, poetry, and theatrical performance, but she also understood that cultural achievement was a form of soft power that could enhance England's international reputation and strengthen domestic unity. The Queen, who could patronize Shakespeare, was demonstrating that England was not a peripheral European nation, but a center of civilization worthy of respect and admiration. The theatrical explosion of the 1580s and 1590s was particularly significant for Elizabeth's reign because drama provided a way to explore political and social themes that could not be discussed directly in a society where criticism of royal policy could be construed as treason. Shakespeare's history plays, for example, offered commentary on the nature of kingship, the problems of succession, and the costs of political ambition that was clearly relevant to contemporary politics, even as it was safely displaced onto past reigns. Elizabeth's relationship with Shakespeare and other playwrights was complex and carefully managed. She attended performances at court and clearly enjoyed the entertainment they provided, but she also understood that theatrical representations of royal power could be dangerous as well as flattering. The deposition scene in Richard II was considered so potentially seditious that it was regularly censored, and the Earl of Essex would later commission a performance of the play on the eve of his rebellion. The music of Elizabeth's court was equally sophisticated and politically charged. Composers like William Byrd and Thomas Tallis created works that celebrated Elizabeth's reign, while carefully navigating the religious divisions that still troubled English society. Byrd, who was secretly Catholic, managed to serve a Protestant queen while maintaining his religious convictions through the careful use of musical ambiguity and coded references. Elizabeth's own musical abilities were considerable and politically significant. Her skill at the virginals, a keyboard instrument, became associated with her virginity and was used as a symbol of her personal purity and artistic refinement. Her dancing, particularly her performance of the energetic galliard, demonstrated her physical vitality and grace well into her 60s, countering suggestions that she was too old and frail to rule effectively. The poetry dedicated to Elizabeth during this period created a mythological framework for understanding her reign that would influence English literature for centuries. Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen presented Elizabeth as Gloriana, a perfect fusion of political authority, personal virtue, and aesthetic beauty. The poem was both sincere tribute and sophisticated propaganda, creating an idealized version of Elizabeth that was more powerful than any realistic portrait could have been. But the cultural achievements of Elizabeth's reign also reflected the increasing artificiality of court life during her later years. The elaborate entertainments, the complex allegorical poetry, and the increasingly stylized court ceremonies were partly an attempt to distract attention from the growing problems of religious conflict, economic hardship, and military expense that marked the 1590s. The gap between the idealized Elizabeth of court poetry and the political reality of her later reign was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The Gloriana of Spenser's imagination bore little resemblance to the aging queen, who was presiding over brutal military campaigns in Ireland and religious persecution at home. The cultural golden age was built partly on a foundation of deliberate self-deception about the moral costs of Elizabeth's political success. Elizabeth's patronage of exploration and discovery during this period was similarly complex in its motivations and consequences. The voyages of Francis Drake, Martin Frobisher, and other English sea captains were celebrated as heroic achievements that expanded English knowledge and influence, but they were also piratical expeditions that attacked Spanish commerce and contributed to the international tensions that led to the Armada. The beginning of English colonial ventures during Elizabeth's reign established patterns of exploitation and violence that would characterize English imperial expansion for centuries. The attempts to establish colonies in Ireland and North America during the 1580s and 1590s involved the same assumptions about English superiority and native inferiority that would later justify more extensive imperial conquest. Elizabeth's personal involvement in these colonial ventures was significant but carefully disguised. She provided financial support and political protection for expeditions that were technically private ventures, allowing her to claim credit for their successes while denying responsibility for their failures. This approach reflected her general strategy of maintaining flexibility by avoiding formal commitments while encouraging activities that served English interests. The cultural renaissance of Elizabeth's reign was thus both authentic achievement and elaborate performance, genuine artistic flowering and sophisticated propaganda campaign. The poets and playwrights who celebrated Elizabeth's golden age were creating works of lasting value, but they were also participating in the construction of a myth that obscured as much as it revealed about the realities of Tudor governance. The relationship between Elizabeth and Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, represented both the culmination and the destruction of the Elizabethan cult of courtly love. Essex was everything that Elizabeth valued in her courtiers: young, handsome, brave, and intellectually gifted. But he was also everything that made such relationships dangerous: ambitious, impulsive, and ultimately disloyal. Essex came to court in the mid-1580s as the stepson of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, carrying with him the blessing of Elizabeth's greatest love and the promise of continuing the tradition of noble favourites that had provided her with emotional support throughout her reign. But where Leicester had been politically sophisticated and personally devoted to Elizabeth, Essex was naive about court politics and increasingly resentful of the limitations that royal favour imposed on his ambitions. Elizabeth's initial attraction to Essex was both maternal and romantic. At 19, he was young enough to be her son, but his charm and vitality awakened feelings in the 50-something queen that reminded her of her youth and her capacity for passion. The relationship that developed between them was intense and psychologically complex, combining elements of mother-son affection, royal patron-courtier loyalty, and quasi-romantic attachment. Essex's rapid rise at court was meteoric and politically dangerous. Within a few years of his arrival, he had been appointed to the Privy Council, given command of military expeditions, and granted monopolies that made him one of the wealthiest men in England. His ascendancy created jealousy among other courtiers and resentment among those who believed his advancement was based on personal favour rather than merit. But Essex's personality was fundamentally unsuited to the patient, indirect approach that successful court politics required. Where Elizabeth valued subtlety and calculation, Essex preferred direct action and dramatic gestures. Where she understood the need for compromise and flexibility, he demanded absolute loyalty and unquestioning support for his positions. The first serious conflict between Elizabeth and Essex occurred during the 1590s over his desire to marry Frances Walsingham, the widow of Sir Philip Sidney and daughter of Elizabeth's former spymaster. Elizabeth's reaction to the marriage was furious and vindictive. She temporarily banished Essex from court and refused to speak to him for months. Her response revealed the possessive and emotional nature of her attachment to Essex, which went far beyond the normal relationship between queen and courtier. Essex's military career provided numerous occasions for conflict with Elizabeth, as his preference for aggressive action conflicted with her cautious and financially constrained approach to warfare. His performance in various expeditions was marked by personal bravery, but strategic incompetence, creating expensive failures that drained the royal treasury without achieving their objectives. The most damaging conflict between Elizabeth and Essex arose from his appointment as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1599. Elizabeth reluctantly agreed to send Essex to suppress Hugh O'Neill's rebellion, despite her reservations about his judgment and his ability to work within the constraints she would impose on his authority. Essex's conduct in Ireland was disastrous both militarily and politically. Instead of confronting O'Neill's forces directly, he wasted time and resources on minor campaigns that achieved nothing significant. When he finally did meet with O'Neill, he agreed to a truce that was far more favourable to the Irish rebels than Elizabeth's instructions had authorised. Most damaging of all, Essex abandoned his command without permission and returned to England to confront Elizabeth directly about his grievances. His sudden appearance at court, muddy and unannounced, demanding audience with the Queen in her private chambers, represented a breach of protocol so serious that it could only be interpreted as a challenge to royal authority. Elizabeth's initial response to Essex's return was carefully controlled. She received him graciously, but made it clear that his conduct in Ireland was unacceptable and that he would face consequences for his failures. Essex was placed under house arrest while his actions were investigated, and it became clear that his career as a royal favourite was effectively over. But Essex's response to his fall from grace was characteristically impulsive and self-destructive. Rather than accepting his disgrace and working to rebuild his relationship with Elizabeth, he began planning a rebellion designed to force her to change her policies and restore him to favour. The Essex Rebellion of February 1601 was amateurishly planned and easily suppressed, but it represented the ultimate betrayal of Elizabeth's trust and affection. The trial and execution of Essex was perhaps the most painful experience of Elizabeth's entire reign. She had genuinely loved the young man who had brought youth and vitality to her aging court, and his betrayal forced her to confront the reality that even her most intimate relationships were vulnerable to the corrupting influence of political ambition. Elizabeth's behaviour during Essex's trial and execution revealed the depth of her emotional investment in their relationship. She delayed signing his death warrant for weeks, hoping that he would appeal for mercy or at least acknowledge his wrongdoing. When no such appeal came, she authorized his execution with obvious reluctance and grief. The aftermath of Essex's execution marked a turning point in Elizabeth's emotional life. The woman who had once delighted in the company of young courtiers became increasingly withdrawn and suspicious of those around her. The death of Essex, combined with the earlier loss of Leicester and other close friends, left her isolated in a way that she had never experienced before. Essex's rebellion also had broader political consequences that damaged Elizabeth's reputation and authority. The fact that her own favourite had turned traitor raised questions about her judgment and her ability to inspire loyalty. The brutality with which the rebellion was suppressed, including the execution of several young noblemen who had followed Essex, created resentment among families who had previously supported the Queen. Perhaps most damaging of all, the Essex affair revealed the artificial and ultimately hollow nature of the Elizabethan court culture that had celebrated the relationship between Queen and courtiers as a form of idealized love. The reality that such relationships could turn deadly exposed the courtly love tradition as a dangerous fiction that concealed rather than elevated the brutal realities of political competition. The final years of Elizabeth's reign were marked by the accumulated weight of decades of rule and the psychological burden of outliving most of the people she had cared about. The vital young woman who had captivated Robert Dudley and inspired her subjects with her energy and optimism was now an aging monarch struggling to maintain authority and dignity as her physical and emotional resources declined. Elizabeth's physical appearance in her final years became a source of constant anxiety and careful management. Contemporary accounts describe a woman who had lost most of her teeth, whose hair was thin and grey beneath her elaborate wigs, and whose face was heavily painted to conceal the ravages of age and smallpox scarring. The Queen, who had once been celebrated for her beauty, was now maintaining her public image through increasingly elaborate artifice. The psychological impact of physical decline was particularly difficult for Elizabeth, because her authority had always been partly based on her personal charisma and physical presence. The woman who had appeared before her troops at Tilbury as a warrior queen in gleaming armour was now struggling to maintain the energy needed for court ceremonies and public appearances. Elizabeth's emotional state during her final years was marked by increasing isolation and depression. The deaths of Leicester, Walsingham, Burghley, and Essex had removed most of the people who had provided her with genuine companionship and emotional support. She was surrounded by courtiers who competed for her favour, but could never replace the deep personal relationships she had lost. The Queen, who had once taken pleasure in dancing, music, and witty conversation, became increasingly withdrawn and difficult to approach. Contemporary accounts describe a monarch who was often moody and unpredictable, subject to sudden rages followed by periods of melancholy silence. The careful emotional control that had characterized her earlier reign was breaking down under the accumulated stress of decades of rule. Elizabeth's relationship with her subjects also changed during her final years as economic hardship and military expenses created resentment that had not existed during the earlier, more successful periods of her reign. The Queen, who had once been celebrated as Good Queen Bess, was now seen by many as an aging autocrat who was reluctant to address the problems facing ordinary English people. The succession question that Elizabeth had successfully avoided throughout most of her reign became increasingly urgent as her health declined, and it became clear that she would die without direct heirs. Her refusal to name a successor created anxiety throughout England and uncertainty among foreign governments about England's future political orientation. Elizabeth's handling of the succession question in her final years revealed both her political sophistication and her personal psychological difficulties. She understood that naming a successor too early might create a rival center of power that could threaten her authority, but she also recognized that failing to provide for an orderly succession might lead to civil war after her death. The solution she ultimately chose, allowing James VI of Scotland to emerge as the obvious heir, while never formally naming him as her successor, demonstrated her continued political skill, even as her physical and emotional resources declined. James was Protestant, experienced in royal governance, and had a clear hereditary claim through his descent from Henry VIII's sister Margaret Tudor. But Elizabeth's refusal to name James formally as her heir also reflected her difficulty in accepting the approaching end of her reign and her life. The woman who had spent 45 years ruling England was psychologically unable to acknowledge that her rule would end and that someone else would take her place. The economic problems of Elizabeth's final years also reflected the accumulated costs of her long reign. Decades of warfare against Spain, the expensive suppression of Irish rebellion, and the maintenance of a large navy had depleted England's treasury and created debts that would burden her successor. The Queen, who had once boasted of England's fiscal responsibility, was leaving behind a legacy of financial difficulty. Elizabeth's court, during her final years, became increasingly factional and corrupt, as courtiers competed for favour from an aging monarch whose judgment was less reliable than it had once been. The sale of monopolies and royal offices became more blatant, creating resentment among those who could not afford to purchase royal favour and economic hardship for ordinary consumers. The contrast between the idealized Gloriana of court poetry and the reality of Elizabeth's final years was stark and painful for those who had served her throughout her reign. The woman who had once embodied the hopes and aspirations of English Protestantism was now a figure of pathos rather than inspiration. clinging to power and youth in ways that diminished rather than enhanced her legacy. Elizabeth's final illness in the winter of 1603 was both a personal tragedy and a political crisis that threatened to destabilize everything she had worked to achieve during her 45-year reign. The Queen, who had survived assassination attempts, foreign invasion, and domestic rebellion, was finally facing an enemy she could not defeat through political skill or military force, the natural process of aging and death. The symptoms of Elizabeth's final decline were apparent to everyone at court during the winter of 1602-1603. She became increasingly listless and withdrawn, refused to take proper nourishment, and spent long hours sitting motionless on cushions rather than lying in bed. Her behavior suggested someone who had lost the will to live, rather than someone suffering from a specific medical condition. The psychological factors contributing to Elizabeth's decline were complex and reflected the accumulated emotional burdens of her long reign. The death of Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, in February 1603, was particularly devastating because it removed one of her last remaining personal friends and reminded her of her increasing isolation. Contemporary accounts of Elizabeth's final weeks describe a woman who seemed to be deliberately choosing death over continued life. She refused medical treatment, ignored her doctor's advice, and rejected the food and rest that might have preserved her strength. Her behavior suggested someone who had concluded she had nothing left to live for and was ready to surrender the burdens of rule. Elizabeth's refusal to go to bed during her final illness was both practical and symbolic. On a practical level, she may have understood that once she took to her bed, she would never rise again, and she was not ready to make that final acknowledgement of defeat. Symbolically, remaining upright was a way of maintaining royal dignity and authority, even as her body failed. The political implications of Elizabeth's declining health created a crisis atmosphere at court, as her ministers and courtiers prepared for the transition to a new reign, while trying to maintain government stability during the interregnum. The woman who had avoided naming a successor throughout her reign was finally forced to indicate her choice, though even this was done indirectly through gestures rather than formal declarations. Elizabeth's reported confirmation that James VI of Scotland should succeed her was both inevitable and appropriate. James was the obvious choice based on hereditary claims, political experience, and religious compatibility. But Elizabeth's endorsement helped ensure a peaceful transition and prevented the succession disputes that had marked earlier Tudor transitions. The final irony of Elizabeth's reign was that the woman who had spent her entire life avoiding marriage and childbearing was succeeded by the son of the woman she had executed. Mary Queen of Scots' victory was posthumous but complete. Her son would rule the kingdom that had been denied to her, and the Scottish royal line would continue on the English throne that Elizabeth's refusal to marry had left vacant. Elizabeth died in the early hours of March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace, surrounded by her ministers and ladies-in-waiting, but without the close personal relationships that had sustained her during earlier crises. Contemporary accounts describe a peaceful death, with Elizabeth slipping quietly away after months of gradual decline. The immediate response to Elizabeth's death was carefully orchestrated to ensure governmental continuity and prevent any disruption during the transition to James I's reign. Her ministers had prepared for this moment for years, and the proclamation of James as king was made within hours of Elizabeth's death, before news of her passing could spread and create uncertainty. But the broader response to Elizabeth's death reflected the complex and often contradictory feelings that her long reign had inspired. She was mourned as the last of the Tudors and celebrated as the queen who had defended England against foreign invasion and domestic rebellion. At the same time, there was relief that the succession had been settled peacefully, and hope that a new reign might address the problems that had accumulated during Elizabeth's final years. Elizabeth I died as she had lived, alone, surrounded by the ceremony and protocol that had defined her existence, but fundamentally isolated from the normal human relationships that might have provided comfort in her final moments. The Virgin Queen's dangerous game had lasted 45 years and had transformed England from a divided, vulnerable nation into a major European power. But the personal cost had been enormous. The death of Elizabeth I marked the end of one of England's most dramatic and influential royal dynasties. The Tudors had ruled for 118 years, transforming England from a medieval kingdom into a Renaissance nation-state, but their legacy was as complex and contradictory as Elizabeth's own reign had been. Henry VII had established the dynasty through military victory and political skill, ending the Wars of the Roses and bringing stability to a nation exhausted by civil conflict. Henry VIII had broken with Rome and established England's religious independence, but at enormous personal and political cost. Edward VI had briefly created a thoroughly Protestant nation before dying at age 15. Mary the Fair had attempted Catholic restoration through persecution and foreign marriage, making herself deeply unpopular. Elizabeth had somehow managed to balance all these contradictory forces while maintaining her own authority and England's independence. The funeral of Elizabeth was a magnificent spectacle that reflected both genuine mourning and careful political theatre. Her body lay in state at Whitehall Palace for weeks, with a lifelike effigy dressed in royal robes placed on top of her coffin to maintain the symbolic presence of monarchy during the interregnum. The funeral procession through London was attended by thousands of mourners, and contemporary accounts describe genuine grief among the crowds who had known no other monarch. But Elizabeth's funeral was also the beginning of James III's reign, and the ceremonies were designed to demonstrate continuity between the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. James had carefully prepared for his accession and moved quickly to establish his authority and reassure his new subjects about his intentions. The peaceful transition from Elizabeth to James was perhaps the greatest triumph of Elizabeth's political legacy. The immediate reaction to Elizabeth's death among her subjects was complex and reflected the contradictory aspects of her reign. She was mourned as the queen who had defended England against Spanish invasion and brought stability to a nation torn by religious conflict. At the same time, there was recognition that her reign had been marked by increasing authoritarianism, religious persecution, and economic hardship that had made life difficult for ordinary English people. Foreign reactions to Elizabeth's death were equally complex. Catholic Europe mourned the end of the heretical queen who had supported Protestant rebels and defied papal authority. But there was also recognition that Elizabeth had been a formidable opponent whose political skill had frustrated Catholic hopes for English reconquest. Protestant nations mourned the loss of their most important ally, but hoped that James V would continue Elizabeth's support for international Protestantism. The transformation of Elizabeth I from historical figure into legendary symbol began almost immediately after her death and continued for centuries afterward. The Virgin Queen became a mythical figure whose reign was remembered as a golden age of English achievement and whose personal sacrifice was celebrated as the ultimate expression of patriotic duty. The Elizabethan myth was partly created by the same propaganda machine that had supported Elizabeth during her lifetime. Poets, playwrights, and historians who had celebrated Gloriana during her reign continued to promote an idealized vision of her rule that emphasized its achievements while downplaying its failures and moral compromises. But the myth was also shaped by the genuine achievements of Elizabeth's reign and the dramatic contrast between her success and the failures of her predecessors and successors. The woman who had defeated the Spanish Armada, supported Shakespeare and other cultural figures, and maintained England's independence for 45 years, was genuinely worthy of celebration and admiration. The darker aspects of Elizabeth's reign, the religious persecution, the brutal suppression of Irish rebellion, the increasing authoritarianism of her later years, were gradually forgotten or minimized in popular memory. The Virgin Queen of legend was a figure of pure inspiration, rather than the complex and often morally compromised ruler that Elizabeth had actually been. Elizabeth's personal sacrifice of marriage and motherhood became central to the Elizabethan myth, transforming what had been a calculated political strategy into a romantic story of a woman who chose duty over personal happiness. The reality that Elizabeth had avoided marriage, partly because it would have diminished her power, was replaced by the fiction that she had given up love for the sake of her people. The cult of Elizabeth that developed after her death also reflected deeper anxieties about female rule and women's roles in society. Elizabeth was celebrated partly because she had exercised power while maintaining her chastity, suggesting that female authority was acceptable only when it was combined with sexual purity. The myth of the Virgin Queen reinforced rather than challenged traditional assumptions about women's proper place in society. Modern historical scholarship has worked to separate the Elizabeth of legend from the Elizabeth of history, recognizing both her genuine achievements and her significant failures. Contemporary historians understand Elizabeth as a skilled but not infallible ruler who faced extraordinary challenges and made difficult decisions that often involved moral compromise. The feminist reclamation of Elizabeth as a proto-feminist icon has been similarly complex and problematic. While Elizabeth certainly demonstrated that women could exercise political authority successfully, her reign also reinforced the idea that female rulers needed to be exceptional and abnormal to be accepted. She succeeded partly by presenting herself as a unique exception, rather than as proof that women in general were capable of political leadership. Elizabeth's greatest achievement was not any single military victory or political success, but rather her transformation of the English monarchy itself. She had inherited a throne that was unstable, contested, and dependent on foreign support, and she transformed it into an institution that was thoroughly English, broadly popular, and capable of surviving the challenges that would face it in later centuries. The dangerous game that Elizabeth had played throughout her reign, using her sexuality as a political weapon while avoiding the trap of marriage, balancing religious factions while maintaining her own authority, projecting strength while acknowledging her limitations as a female ruler, had ultimately succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. Elizabeth had proved that a woman could rule England successfully, not by rejecting traditional feminine roles, but by manipulating them for political advantage. She had used the conventional expectations about women's behavior to create a unique form of royal authority that was both familiar and revolutionary. The precedent that Elizabeth established for female monarchy would influence English political culture for centuries. Future queens regnant like Anne and Victoria would draw on the Elizabethan model of combining feminine virtue with royal authority, while the cult of monarchy that Elizabeth created would provide stability through civil wars, revolutions, and world wars. But Elizabeth's transformation of English monarchy came at enormous personal cost. The woman who had mastered the dangerous game of power had condemned herself to a life of magnificent isolation, surrounded by ceremony and protocol, but denied the normal human relationships that might have provided genuine happiness and fulfillment. The Virgin Queen's ultimate victory was thus also her greatest tragedy. She had transformed England from a weak, divided nation into a major European power, had established cultural and political institutions that would endure for centuries, and had created a model of monarchy that balanced authority with accountability. But she had achieved these successes by sacrificing everything that might have made her personally happy: love, marriage, motherhood, and normal human relationships. The dangerous game that Elizabeth played required her to be simultaneously stronger and weaker than she actually was, stronger in her public projection of authority and confidence, weaker in her private acknowledgement of vulnerability and need for support. She had to present herself as divinely appointed and naturally superior, while recognizing that her authority depended on the consent and loyalty of her subjects. Elizabeth's manipulation of gender expectations was perhaps her most sophisticated political achievement. She had managed to rule as a woman in a world that assumed political authority was naturally masculine, not by rejecting femininity, but by redefining it to serve her political purposes. The Virgin Queen was both pure maiden and warrior goddess, both submissive daughter and commanding mother, both vulnerable woman and invincible monarch. The psychological cost of maintaining these contradictory roles throughout a 45-year reign was enormous. Elizabeth had to be constantly vigilant about her public image, carefully controlling every word and gesture to maintain the complex persona she had created. She could never relax, never show weakness, never admit doubt or uncertainty, without risking the collapse of the entire structure of authority she had built. But Elizabeth's personal sacrifice had created something larger and more enduring than any individual happiness could have been. She had established England as a major European power, had defended Protestant Christianity against Catholic reconquest, had supported the cultural achievements that made the Elizabethan age legendary, and had created political institutions that would survive the challenges of future centuries. The England that James I inherited in 1603 was fundamentally different from the nation that Elizabeth had inherited. In 1558, it was more prosperous, more confident, more united, and more respected by foreign powers. The dangerous game that Elizabeth had played had transformed England from a peripheral European kingdom into a nation capable of competing with the great powers of the continent. Elizabeth's legacy was thus both personal tragedy and national triumph. She had given her life to the service of her country in the most literal sense, sacrificing every personal desire and relationship to the demands of royal duty. But her sacrifice had created something magnificent and enduring that justified the enormous personal cost. The Virgin Queen's dangerous game had been won at the highest possible stakes, the complete subordination of personal happiness to political necessity. Elizabeth had played that game with consummate skill for 45 years, and in the end, she had achieved a victory that was both complete and hollow, both glorious and heartbreaking, As the courtiers who had surrounded Elizabeth throughout her reign began to transfer their allegiance to James I's, as the ceremonies and protocols of Tudor monarchy gave way to the different style of Stuart rule, as the Elizabethan age passed into history and legend, one thing remained clear. Elizabeth I had been one of the most successful monarchs in English history, but she had also been one of the loneliest people who had ever lived. The dangerous game she had played had required her to choose power over love, duty over happiness, political success over personal fulfillment. She had made those choices consistently and courageously for 45 years, and the England she left behind was a testament to the wisdom of her decisions and the magnitude of her sacrifice. But as the last of the Tudors was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by the pomp and ceremony that had defined her life, the fundamental question remained: had the game been worth playing? Had Elizabeth's magnificent and terrible victory justified the price she had paid to achieve it? The answer, like Elizabeth herself, was complex and contradictory. She had saved England and destroyed herself, had created a golden age and lived in magnificent isolation, had achieved immortality and sacrificed happiness. The Virgin Queen had played the most dangerous game of all, the game of absolute power, and had won everything except what she might have wanted most. In the end, Elizabeth I stands as both inspiration and warning, proof that extraordinary achievements are possible for those willing to pay extraordinary prices, but also a reminder that the cost of playing the dangerous game of power is always higher than we imagine when we begin. The Virgin Queen, who played that game so brilliantly for so long, had ultimately won everything and lost everything, had triumphed completely and failed utterly, had become immortal and remained forever alone. Her legacy endures not just in the political institutions she created or the cultural achievements she supported, but in the complex and troubling questions her life raises about the relationship between power and happiness, between public success and private fulfillment, between the demands of duty and the needs of the human heart. Elizabeth I had played the dangerous game of power better than almost anyone in history, but she had also paid the full price for her victory. The Virgin Queen's triumph was complete, but so was her sacrifice, and perhaps that, more than any political achievement or military victory, is what makes her story so compelling and so heartbreaking. The recognition that even the most spectacular success can be a form of magnificent failure, and that the most dangerous game of all might be the one we think we have won. As we close this long journey through the life of Elizabeth I, let us remember her not just as the glorious Gloriana of legend, but as the complex, brilliant, and ultimately tragic woman who chose to sacrifice everything personal for something larger than herself. She played a dangerous game of power with unmatched skill and achieved victory beyond her wildest dreams. But she also paid a price that few would be willing to pay, and fewer still would be capable of paying. The Virgin Queen's story is both triumphant and heartbreaking, inspiring and cautionary, magnificent and terrible. It reminds us that greatness often comes at costs we cannot imagine, that power is the most seductive and destructive force in human affairs, and that even the most successful life can be a form of beautiful tragedy. Elizabeth I was, in the end, exactly what she had always claimed to be, a queen who belonged not to herself, but to England, a woman who had given everything for her people and her nation. She had played the dangerous game of power and won, but the victory had consumed everything that might have made her personally happy. She had achieved immortality, but had lived in magnificent solitude, had saved England, but had lost herself. That is the final truth about Elizabeth I. She was both the greatest success and the greatest sacrifice in the history of English monarchy, a woman who had proved that the dangerous game of power could be won, but had also demonstrated that winning it might be the most Pyrrhic victory of all. And so, we leave her as she lived, alone with her triumph, magnificent in her isolation, victorious in her defeat, immortal in her humanity, the Virgin Queen who played the dangerous game and won everything except what she might have wanted most. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of Renaissance England, of a young woman who became the greatest queen in English history by choosing duty over desire, power over love, immortality over happiness. Dream of Elizabeth I, who played the most dangerous game of all and emerged victorious, though the victory came at a price that few could pay, and fewer still would choose to pay. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of the Virgin Queen, who dared to play the dangerous game of power and won it all, except perhaps what mattered most.